Ready to go?
Yep.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. I'm joined by Marina Boulos-Winton. She's the Executive Director of Chez Doris, and we're here to discuss the interconnectivity between domestic violence and homelessness. Marina, thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Could you tell us a little bit about Chez Doris and the work that you do?
Certainly. So Chez Doris is a day shelter for women in difficulty that was founded in 1977. Its name comes from a woman who in the 1970s found herself to be homeless and in trouble, and there weren't very many resources for women in the 1970s, and there still aren't very many today. Her name was Doris Kenny, also known as Doris Toussaint. And unfortunately, as many women who are homeless, they are victimized, and she was murdered. Unfortunately, her body was found in 1974, and there were a group of concerned citizens who banded together and decided to open a day shelter while also honoring her name. So that's why we're called Chez Doris. So we're located not far from Concordia on Chamedy Street between St. Catherine Street and de Maisonneuve.
Perfect. Thank you for explaining. And how long have you been involved in Chez Doris?
So I've been involved with Chez Doris for 6 years now as the executive director. And it is an organization that is evolving and growing. So I think in a year from now, we will be, well, the pandemic has also changed the services that we offer, or we've added additional services. So typically, we're an organization that's open, well, we're always open 7 days a week. We used to be open between 8:30 to 3 p.m. And now we're open till about 9:30 p.m. and until the end of June, until further notice. We are also operating a hotel to serve as an emergency shelter. Actually, it's the floor of a hotel with 40 rooms. And so we offer basic services like meals, access to showers, hygiene products, food bags, a financial management program where we manage the finances of women. We have programming for Indigenous women. We help women find apartments in the private market. We also provide health and mental health services and legal services. We do taxes and, you know, within the realities of the pandemic, we sometimes offer social recreational activities or educational programs.
Okay, you guys do a lot.
We do a lot, yeah.
Okay, that's good to hear. And the hotel you were just talking about, is this located nearby Chez Doris?
So it's not far from Chez Doris. The women take a shuttle to get there. We do not state what the address is, so as not to encourage too many undesirable people to wait outside and further victimize the women that who go there. So there you go. And but pretty soon, actually, in about a year's time or less, we will be running our own emergency shelter in another building not far from Chez Doris.
Okay, and what is the difference between Chez Doris, any other shelter, and an emergency shelter?
So, in the, let's say, shelter community, you have an emergency shelter where your bed is not necessarily reserved for you. So you have to call every day and make sure that you have a spot. Very often, so there are anywhere, pre-pandemic, anywhere from 800 to 1,000 beds for both men and women, but only 10–14% of the beds are reserved for women, whereas they make 25% of the homeless population. So clearly there's a shortage. We've seen with the pandemic that there are well over 3,000, I would say even 6,000 homeless people on any given day. We've seen at Chez Doris in a year, excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. We've seen at Chez Doris about 824 different women in the span of approximately a year of the pandemic, which is double what we normally see. We see all sorts of women in difficulty. It doesn't mean that they're homeless. We do a lot of homelessness prevention. We normally see 350 to 450 women. So it's quite remarkable that we've seen more than 800.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah. So, but the difference between the shelters is that you also have transitional shelters where they give you a longer period of time to stay. And then you also have battered women's shelters, which is not our specialty, but it's for women who are victims of conjugal violence. And so they'll go to a battered women's shelter.
Okay, thank you. On that note, I just wanted to address in the last episode of Local 514, we discussed the barriers that survivors face in escaping situations of domestic violence. So these type of barriers include funding and some services not being accessible for all survivors. On average, Quebec experiences 12 femicides per year. So far in 2021, there have been 10 femicides in Quebec. Many shelters for domestic violence survivors have reported an increase in domestic violence during the pandemic. At Chez Doris, have you seen an increase in clients who are experiencing domestic violence?
So we see both women, or we get calls from both women who are experiencing domestic violence because there's no room at the battered women's shelters. We also get calls from women who are, well, obviously they're looking for room, and then, or they've been at a battered women's shelter and they've overextended their time. And so they need to find other accommodations and they haven't found their own apartment, let's say. So they come to Chez Doris and they can become technically homeless because they don't have a fixed address. And we also see women who are homeless then get further victimized because they will suffer from violence towards women on the streets. So there you go.
Okay, thank you. And have you maybe noticed, since especially during the pandemic, we've seen rents really skyrocket? Would you maybe say that this is also contributing to homelessness, especially among domestic violence survivors?
Absolutely, because one's economic ability or bandwidth is dependent maybe on the abuser, right? And then if you suddenly walk away, you have a lot to lose economically for some women. So they have to start over. Some women will often leave without their clothing, without shoes. Their abuser tries to control them. So we'll often also see women who will appear at Chez Doris in the middle of the winter without a pair of shoes on, and without a coat, because they have fled, let's say, in a taxi, and have come straight to Chez Doris for help. And very often they don't have their IDs as well, because their identification has been taken away from them. So they have to start all over again, the process of getting ID in order to then register to get help or to get financial aid.
Okay. So within the last provincial budget, the government provided an increase in $4.5 million annually to create more spaces in shelters. Since the funding for domestic violence shelters was much lower than many domestic violence shelter workers were hoping for, would you say that this maybe puts a strain on homeless shelters, domestic violence shelters, and especially Chez Doris?
I think it puts a strain on everybody, certainly. It certainly puts us, well, first and foremost, it puts a strain on the battered women's shelters because it's obviously not very much money to spread around between 43 organizations across Quebec. And it does put a strain on us ultimately because they're not going to have the bandwidth to do their work or to respond to the needs. I understand that the government has proposed more funding. And today there was an announcement by the federal government that there is also funding for organizations to do counseling or prevention with men where they are the abusers or the potential abusers. So I think that that is a very good initiative because I think prevention and counseling is needed.
Thank you for bringing that up. You know, with people who are escaping domestic violence and especially women with children, I just want to know, does Chez Doris allow children to access your services?
No, unfortunately not, because prior to the pandemic, we had a lot of, we still do have women who have mental health issues. We're not equipped to take children. Our building is the size of a large townhouse with an extension. So we really don't have the room, especially when you can get as many as 100 different women a day in different types of crisis situations. So there are other organizations that will help, not many, that will help women with additional housing. Or what happens is that maybe they'll place their children in the care of family. But if they really cannot find housing and they don't have anybody to help them, then their only recourse is really to place their children with youth protection, which is a really difficult thing to do. Because then once you do find housing stability, you have to prove that you're capable of taking care of your children.
And I know at the beginning you spoke about the different type of services that Chez Doris offers. Are there maybe any services that are specific when dealing with domestic violence survivors?
I really think that it's unfortunate, but it places the burden on us to do counsel women who are victims of domestic violence. But I think that women who are currently victims of domestic violence are better off calling SOS Violence Conjugale to see where they can get help, because that is their specialty. We're probably more generalists than specialists, but we do have psychologist on that comes on a volunteer basis, psychiatrist as well. And we have a great team of counselors amongst our staff who could help. I think the assistance that we give is extremely practical as well. It's trying to not only lend a listening ear to women, but also try to resolve their problems if they want to resolve their problems.
And to a certain extent, does Chez Doris work alongside domestic violence shelters?
So we may be referred to, so we cross-refer. So for instance, if we feel that a woman would be better served by a battered women's shelter. So right now, because we have services for homeless women overnight, we can keep them temporarily and then refer them somewhere as soon as there's room. So we can make those calls for ladies. And then especially if a woman is single and her problem is not resolved and they have to make room for maybe a woman with children, that typically this can happen with single women where they're asked, okay, you're going to have to you've been given, enough time, and you have to now move on to something else. So they will refer to shelters.
Thank you for explaining that.
Sure.
How do you think that the government can further help homeless shelters such as Chez Doris to better serve, everyone, but also in particular domestic violence survivors?
I think that there needs to be more shelter beds for women, for both women, both who are victims of domestic abuse, as well as homeless shelters. And there needs to be more affordable housing, because it is, especially if women are depending on social assistance to stabilize themselves, and they're earning somewhere from like $633 to $800 and something dollars. It's really not enough to cover the rent. So I think social assistance also needs to probably be looked at again, and be indexed for the inflation for housing, because those who live below the poverty line can no longer afford to live on the island.
During your time at Chez Doris, have you noticed certain unique challenges that homeless domestic violence survivors face in comparison to other homeless women?
I think for those who are victims of domestic violence, I think their anonymity is more important, especially if they're being stalked. And so our address is not confidential of our day shelter. So it can be an issue if they're being stalked. And that's why I'm saying that we might not be the best organization. We're a temporary solution as opposed to a permanent solution or a medium to long-term solution.
Of course. And due to the need to physically distance because of the pandemic, how many people could Chez Doris hold pre-pandemic in comparison to now?
So we would receive an average of 90 women a day between 8:30 to 3 p.m. And sometimes we would hold as many as 120 women in our location. But because of social distancing measures, we cannot have more than 35 to 40, which gave us the difficult decision to only help homeless women on site for the most part, as opposed to also low-income women, because we can't accommodate everyone. So we figured they are the most vulnerable. They need to eat. And they need to be, warm and safe. And so that's what's happened. But we've extended our hours so that we can serve more women. And we're now averaging about 70, 71 women a day, but they come over the course of the day. Unfortunately, we can't sit more than 35 women with the 2 meters apart between them. So that's where we are with that. I think with the summer, it'll be a little easier, where we can maybe set up the courtyard as well as a place where women can eat. So we'll have probably some additional spots.
Okay. And are there any maybe other challenges outside of space that you guys have faced during the pandemic?
Well, the fact that we've extended our hours by more than, actually we're 24 hours, but at a different location. We've had to quickly hire new staff for the pandemic. As well, we decided we could see that housing was an issue, so we set up a housing search service and placement program. So we've gone from a staff of 24 to more than 51, and an operating budget of 2.3 before to an operating budget of more than $3.5 million.
Okay.
So it's pretty significant, very tiring. It was a lot of work to put in place. And it made us put things in place more than a year before we were really ready, because all the services that we've put in are services that were meant for the year 2022, when we'll have our own shelter.
Okay.
We'll also have by then, by spring of 2022, a couple of residences as well, so where we're creating housing that is affordable for women who are low income and at risk of becoming homeless.
Okay. And I guess what is your personal opinion on how you think the municipal, and I guess in particular provincial government, has handled this increase in domestic violence during the pandemic?
I think they're reactive to. It's amazing how when there is a public display of dissatisfaction, that's when the government will react, as opposed to sitting face to face with government officials saying, you know, there's a problem. I think it's more in a way embarrassing to them when there's an outcry, that they'll respond to the outcry. So kudos to people who complain, right? I think it's unfortunate, but that's what people have to do.
Okay. And do you think maybe if the government were providing the funding that these domestic shelters are hoping for, do you think that you would see less cases of domestic violence survivors who are homeless at Chez Doris?
I think that it's in some, well, look, I think we also see a lot of Indigenous women who come to Chez Doris. They now represent 30% of our clientele. And we do see women coming from up north or fleeing locally, domestic abuse situations. So I think that in all communities, I don't want to pinpoint any one community, but I think there's a lot of education that needs to be done in terms of preventing violence in one's home. I think children are also affected by it very much. And over time, it brings a lot of mental health issues to people who have grown up in violent homes, and they are at higher risk for homelessness.
In your experience, have you ever maybe come across any cases where someone using the services at Chez Doris was hesitant to go to a shelter specifically for domestic violence survivors?
I don't think so, no. Nobody's ever been hesitant, but what is the main thing that women are hesitant about, especially within the Indigenous community, is calling the police or lodging a complaint, because they're worried that, especially for Indigenous women, they are over, in French, it's sur-judiciarisé. So like they're involved far more than other populations with the court system. So for instance, if they haven't paid, I don't know, if they got a ticket for loitering, let's say, or being out after dark or something like that right now during the curfew, they will have a summons to appear at court, and they do not show up. That means that there will be a warrant for their arrest. So I remember my first experience with a domestic abuse survivor who fled who fled and came straight to Chez Doris, and she wanted to call the police. She lived not far from Chez Doris, and the police had to bring her to, in the end, the police, sure, her boyfriend got arrested, but she kind of got arrested as well because there was a warrant for her arrest because she did not obey a summons to go to court. So it was really disheartening for her to have to go to the police station.
Would you say that, especially in terms of like non-white communities, is there a fear in cases of domestic violence? Is there a fear of maybe being treated differently due to systemic racism within the police force?
We haven't had any. I can't say that there. We have a lot of diversity at Chez Doris, and I think the systemic, there's an element of shame of having to flee one's household, and depending on the community, it's not about the police, but having to abandon your marriage, right? So there's a lot of shame associated to that, and so our counselors deal with that in the sessions where they're counseling the ladies that we see.
Is there any maybe resources you would recommend for folks who don't wish to call the police in situations of domestic violence?
Well, they certainly need to call SOS Violence Conjugale. And for men who are concerned about their own behavior, there's an organization called PROGAM, PRO-GAM, that offers referrals and counseling for men who are abusers.
Thank you for sharing that. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think is important to consider when discussing domestic violence amongst homeless populations?
I think it's important for most of domestic violence situations happens to women under the age of 40. And for the women and young men who are listening to this program, I think they have to recognize little things that are going on in their relationship right now that might be alarming or raise some flags that they need to step away from. So if you have a partner who is preventing you from seeing your friends, is criticizing you for constantly how you look, what you wear, who is controlling your ID, how you spend your money. These are telltale signs of somebody who is trying to take control of you. And that's what, that's how it starts with an abuser. So I would say, to young ladies who are listening to this, to just be aware of that, and the abusers as well as and who are trying to dominate their partner.
Thank you so much, for Marina, for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Sure. Thank you. Okay. Bye.
Thank you, everyone, for watching.